thank you to Betsy and all of our panelists. We have saved perhaps our most timely conversation for last. So with us to discuss election security as well as disinformation, we have Kim Zetter, the author of Countdown to Zero Day, Stuxnet and the Launch of the World's First Digital Weapon. Joining her will be Bob Lord, the CSO of the DNC, Kevin Mandia, CEO of FireEye, and the conversation will be moderated once again by the Aspen Institute's Garrett Graff. So if you could please help me in welcoming our election security and disinformation panel to the stage.
It's great. I'm on a panel in a room full of people that already get it. Yeah.
You can let me as soon as they do. Like, hey, it's not as.
Oh, I gotta get in there. Sorry, guys. I gotta run in. Will I catch you night there? You going to this thing?
I'm good.
All right.
See you, buddy.
Take care.
Yeah, he's busy.
Thanks for joining us, Kevin.
No sweat.
Cool. Well, you've made it to the end. This is the final panel tonight for the Cybersecurity Summit here. I'm Garrett Graff, the director of the cyber program again. I'm actually not Kim Zetter. I'm filling in for Mike Rogers, who couldn't make it today. And we have promoted Kim to a panelist herself, since you would be hard-pressed to find someone who actually knows election infrastructure security better than she does. So we've got a great group to discuss both what has transpired over the last couple of weeks and then also look ahead a little bit to 2020. Bob Lord, the Chief Security Officer for the Democratic National Committee, not personally responsible for the security on the night of the Watergate burglary. That's an important caveat.
Sorry.
Kevin Mandia and Kim Zetter. Bob, I might start with you. So 2 days after the election, you are in a new role for the DNC, and a role that the 2016 election made all too clear why is now necessary. So tell us a little bit about living through your job this year and what surprised you Tuesday night.
Well, first of all, I'm super happy to be here and not on hold with the FBI. So this was a pretty successful time period for me. So when I started, I think I had a lot of, I don't want to say misconceptions, but I had a lot of things I had to learn as I went from applying my, my tech background to the world of a political party. And so I had to learn a lot of things which are obvious to all the people who were there. But, you know, for example, you know, the DNC does not own all of the state parties. And they're not 50 state parties. There's 55, 57 state parties. And so we don't own them. They are separate legal entities. And those are, of course, separate legal entities from the individual campaigns. And so not only am I tasked with trying to protect the assets and the information in the building, but I'm trying to find ways to influence all of these other organizations through mass hypnosis and other bits of trickery that I've picked up along the way.
And how do you feel, you're obviously here, which means
right.
that Tuesday night was not a colossal disaster.
Right.
But give us sort of some sense of what surprised you going through election night, and maybe try to give a grade to where you think the DNC is security-wise.
Well, I'm certainly not going to answer that question.
Oh, come on.
Well, I mean, so, you know, I think everybody here is you know, has a clear understanding of what happened before. It's been the subject of a number of books. So I think largely people understand the hand that I was dealt and that this is a work in progress. I would say that there's been a ton of good progress that was made before I got there. So there were a group of really fantastic volunteers who came in after the initial breach to help do some remediations. They did fantastic work. So I'm in many ways standing on their shoulders. So in terms of what surprised me, it wasn't really a ton of surprise. We had been going into the election with consultations with people in government, people in various parts of the tech industry, and we were hearing many of the same things, which is we're not hearing a ton. So there were low-grade attacks going on. There were bits of disinformation floating around, but we didn't see the same kinds of things that we would have expected to be signs if we were going to see the same sort of thing that we saw in 2016. And so, I think the two ways to look at that are either they're retooling, they're doing other things, they're not making this a priority for this particular campaign. Of course, the other side is, as my former title at Yahoo was Chief Paranoid. Of course, I had to construct other scenarios so that I wouldn't be blindsided. One scenario that we contemplated with many other people in the tech industry and other parts of the democratic ecosystem is we've just been blind to it. We're missing some critical piece of information. We have information, but we're not putting two and two together. Hindsight will be 20/20, and so how do we try to calculate what might be going wrong? And we went through a number of different scenarios, and we just weren't coming up with anything. Having said that, we, of course, were on high alert, and there was, of course, a great example of us responding very quickly with the issue around that false phishing campaign, which everyone read about. And so I felt like that was, if you want a surprise, I think one of the surprises was how quickly we were able to execute our new playbooks, and also how quickly the tech press understood that our response was fast and aggressive, and that we were able to communicate up our chain as well as out to the 57 state parties very quickly. What was interesting was that some of the DC political press didn't quite understand as well. And so they asked me questions like, how are you going to make sure this never happens again? Okay, how am I going to make sure that nobody ever attempts to hack or that we never have a false alarm? These aren't actually my goals. My goal is to take serious threats seriously and then to be able to react very quickly. And so I think that was one big surprise, was the sort of East Coast, West Coast division between the press.
Mm-hmm. So Kevin, turning to you next, one of the things Bob mentioned that we sort of didn't see a ton of activity so far that has been reported about the nation states coming into foreign information influence operations. But your firm this year sort of did one of the big reports and research around not Russia, which is the main topic of much of our national political cyber dialogue and discussion, but around Iran. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of what you saw Iran doing this year and sort of what you think they learned from 2016?
Yeah, sure. And I just want to say, Bob, you just passed CISO 101. Whenever anybody asks how good you are, you punt the question. Well done.
Learn from the best.
A lot of you probably already know this. I just think, in general, information operations have been here. They're here to stay. We did catch, we had one of our threat analysts catch an Iranian operation at the time at which they caught it. I think a lot of it was an element of a little bit of luck and a lot of experience in that analyst, where we observed sometime in June of this year, someone was tweeting pro-Iranian type themes and anti-Israeli, anti-US, anti-Saudi themes. And that analyst just started paying attention to that person's Twitter handle and what they were tweeting, and quickly decided, let's pierce anonymity behind who this person is. And it came back a Cleveland State University student. And our analyst's gut and intuition was, there's no way this is a Cleveland State University student, and kind of worked the issue a little bit and started pulling threads, and pretty much that same day recognized we had, it looked like an Iranian national doing the tweeting from not the United States or Cleveland State. You unpeel it, and next thing you know, you see information operations done in what you'd expect to see a first-gen capability be. So all the means that we use to detect this wave of information operations is probably already obsolete, and we'll have to deal with whatever their new methods are. Bottom line, we caught the lowest bounds of it. It's fascinating to see. So now we know at least Russia's doing it. We know Iran's doing it, and I'm sure probably 50 other nations are doing it in some capacity.
So Kim, Tuesday night, Tuesday during the day was a good lesson, I think, in how broken the American voting system is on days when it works. And you saw, machines not working and not plugged in, and sort of all sorts of election infrastructure going wrong, even on a day when there was sort of nothing actually going wrong. You've done a lot of reporting this year on the security behind the election infrastructure. sort of take us through sort of what you were worried about Tuesday night and what you were sort of thinking and watching and what has you worried about the state of where our election infrastructure is?
So I guess, so the things that we all saw on Tuesday are things that we see in every election. So there was no surprise with, I hate to say it, there's no surprise with long lines. We've seen that before in multiple presidential elections, and so in the midterms, it's not a surprise. It always happens. The reason changes slightly each time. E-poll books often play a part in this. And part of the problem is the lack of preparation of election officials. They'll always tell you, well, we weren't prepared for the turnout this year, but everyone was prepared for a large turnout this year in midterms. Election officials, you know, in order to have backup paper ballots, if the machines go wrong, that's expensive for them. They don't want to print extra ballots if they don't have to, and so that's the dilemma for them is to wait, and they also don't have a lot of money. They're operating on a budget. So that's what happens there. That's sort of a situation that always happens. In terms of like what is the biggest concern, I think the biggest concern is that we're blind to a lot of things that are still going on. If you ask election officials, federal officials, state officials, before the election, do you think that we're prepared for it? They kept repeating the same line over and over again. This is going to be the most secure election we've ever had. We've never had an election this secure. That's the non-answer. That's not telling you that the election is actually secure. What it's saying is we've done the best that we can, given the circumstances that we have, a short period. A lot of people think 2 years is a lot to resolve this. It's not, because the problems are so vast and they're so varied. So I think for me, the biggest problem is, I want to say it's not quite willful blindness, but there's a lot of also concern, more concern with the issue of confidence in the election. There's a lot of the talk over and over again that we don't want to actually talk about the problems with the infrastructure because that will cause the public to lose confidence in the election. This isn't a new argument. That argument has been around for a decade. And that's the argument that actually got us into the situation where we are now. So that's my biggest concern, is that we sort of wash over things and we don't really dig down to the deeper level.
So Bob, you may or may not, probably will not be in your job on election night 2020.
You know something I know?
Well, I feel like very few people make it through multiple election cycles in committee jobs. Do you?
See, this is something. See, I learn so many things when I come to these conferences. It's already paid for itself.
What is sort of your agenda for what you think needs to happen between, you know, we're sort of as far from the 2020 election as we can be right now. What's your list for what needs to happen between now and election night 2020?
Yeah, so you're right. Actually, Kim just said something important, which is 2 years is not a long time. So yes, we are as far as we can be, and it's not too late to make changes. But I feel like we're still kind of on that end of the spectrum, and so you know the people who need to take action are going to need to take action fairly quickly when we talk about the election infrastructure. So I think I've learned a number of things. One is when I got here, I wanted to build a feedback loop so I could push information out to the committees and to the different campaigns about good security practices. That resulted in a very short one-page document, which I tweeted out an hour ago or so you can take a look at that. Feedback welcome. But I feel like there were a lot of big checklists out there, and what happened is people didn't necessarily read them all. It had great advice, but they weren't very actionable. So I wanted to have something that was super, super short. And so we pushed that out, and then I also asked for feedback and telemetry from the field so I could get a feel for what was actually happening. And in part because even if somebody has found a problem and a security incident and they've resolved it and it's done, if there are 5 different campaigns or states that are having the same problem, that might be an indication that something much worse is happening and that they've been fully diagnosed the problem. So I started to get a lot of telemetry from the field, and so I thought that was very helpful. Luckily, we didn't see any of these massive things. What we saw were a lot of commodity scams. Actually, we saw sort of a next-gen scam, which is a gift card scam, but it starts off with a soft approach. So rather than saying, you know, can you go to Target, give me 2 $100 gift cards, I'll explain later, it starts off by saying, hey, are you in the office? And then they say, yeah, what do you need? And then they give you the little song and dance, I'm out of the office, I'll explain later, go to Target and get me 2 $100 gift cards, scratch off the back and send it to me. So we were actually able to start to see some of these things for which I think I've only seen one article describing that particular campaign. So that was good. It was an example of us getting out a little bit ahead of the rest of the curve. We're going to have to do...
Is a scam targeting campaign workers?
It looked like it was. And it turns out it's a generic scam. And in fact, the one article I found included an interview with an executive at the Better Business Bureau whose staffer had fallen for this particular campaign. So he felt compelled to go to the news. But I found exactly one article on this particular variant of that scam. But again, so we were getting this kind of information back. And although it wasn't indicating massive collusion with foreign governments, any sort of major hiccups like that, we were able to make sure that we had some telemetry coming back. We're going to have to do a lot more of that. We're going to have to get far more metrics driven around this. And I would say that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with a number of issues around people and processes and technologies with the campaigns. Campaigns, I mean, put yourself in the position of somebody running a small business. 5 people, 10 people, 20 people. Imagine all of the headaches associated with trying to secure that little company. It's even worse for a campaign because in some senses it's like a pop-up business. They have a beginning and a middle and an end. And if you put yourself into the mindset of somebody who knows when they go out of business, how much insurance are you going to buy? You know when you're going out of business. And so I think there are some additional burdens that campaigns have that are even worse than what normal small businesses have. And you've all worked with small businesses. I mean, has anybody run into a small business that has 2-factor for all accounts, both personal and, you know what I'm saying, like patched all of their software, all their phones? Like, it doesn't happen. And so these are the kinds of things that we're concerned about. And so I think what we're going to have to do is think about ways to make sure that we can work with them a little bit more closely and make sure that they get through these checklists. I would say that as I've worked with people individually to make sure that they've gone through the checklists, I would say that I've noted a couple things. One is some of these things on the checklist are not people's fault. People don't patch their phones, people don't patch their laptops. And at some point, I think we have to acknowledge that it's just not a thing that people in general know how to do and feel comfortable doing. In fact, there are entire businesses that are set up to help organizations and enterprises patch their software because it's a hard problem. And so I'd love to see the operating system vendors start to figure out how to start patching so that it becomes harder and harder to not run a patched system. We talked about IoT in 2 or 3 sessions. How are we going to get to a point where something that computers do well, which is self-updating, is something that they do by default, as opposed to blaming the users when they haven't patched and then they have some sort of software problem. And when I think about things like using sketchy Wi-Fi, one of the things that bothers me is I don't know what sketchy Wi-Fi is. We always tell people don't use sketchy Wi-Fi.
It's the one that says FBI surveillance ban in the Wi-Fi drop down.
Is that what that means?
Yes.
Because, see, I've learned 2 things here today. And so, I think one of the things we can do is start leaning on the browser manufacturers to adopt some additional controls. So I use HTTPS everywhere. Does anybody else use that? A whole bunch of you. So I use
Rob Joyce raises his hand.
Yeah. And so do you use the checkbox that says block all non-encrypted connections? No? Check it out. Check it out. You will find a surprisingly small number of websites that don't use. That's actually, thank you, Bruce. Bruce just noted that that Rob is using an EFF product. Fantastic. So, one of the things I wonder is why is this a separate add-on that I have to teach people to use? Why can't we throw this into campaign mode or more secure user mode? Like I said, there are very few websites that you run into that I really feel like I want to visit that do not have TLS, HTTPS turned on. So I think that we can start figuring out which are the things where we still have to train users, train people in campaigns, but then let's be honest that there are some things where we should be pushing on the technology providers to do a much better job in getting to that next level and making these things secure by default.
Mm-hmm. So, Kevin, you were talking a little bit about how information influence operations are here to stay. That this is a new tool and something that we need to become more accustomed to, and one of the reasons that Russia was so successful in their operations in 2016 was it was new, it was unexpected, and it was less successful even in the French election because people were expecting it a little bit more. As you sort of look at this and look at information operations sort of at scale across your work, across the globe, how do you think web consumers, citizens, voters need to become sort of more savvy or resilient in looking at and processing information online?
Yeah, it's a good question. Not an expert, but I'll do my best to try. I mean, bottom line is I don't think people want to wake up and be lied to. I think it's a universal truth. We want to know what we're reading, whether it's real or not. And unfortunately, I think what we've seen in the last year is the platforms that harbor social media are starting to recognize there is some responsibility, at least for certain events like elections, to make sure we can control the identities or do the best we can to provide a positive experience on certain things. Bottom line, it's going to be a tough battle for the rest. I don't see an end to it. Nobody can read minds. It's hard to. We have an anonymous internet, and it's going to be a long while. And by the way, it's a cultural decision on how anonymous the internet is in each nation. And it'll be a long time before we can accurately police a platform. I don't know how it's ever going to hit 100% successful. So all you can do is, if you find it, it's community defense. Every company out there that sees it can let people be aware of it. And then you just hope people get informed about that. Don't believe everything you read on a rest area stop on Route 95 South, and don't believe everything you read on the internet.
That's right. Well, I think one of the things that we've found...
That was the third thing that you probably should have
that is,
learned from
I
the
did.
panel. Don't believe everything on the internet.
I knew that one. That one I already knew. And so, I think there's a mantra that you will hear if you talk to a lot of people at some of the social media organizations, the companies, and they will say things like, the best way to counter bad information was with more good information. I don't think we all believe that as much as we did in the past. I think we're starting to get a little bit more sophisticated about understanding what some of these cognitive biases are and how we've had adversaries use those cognitive biases against us. And so the notion that, we talked about policing, it's very difficult, especially because there are cohorts of people who want to receive that kind of information, in part because that's the way our brains are wired. And so it's becoming a much thornier problem than I think anybody had really thought of before.
So one of the questions or one of the themes that I'm hearing you pick up that I want to ask you about is this idea that, if you go back 10, 12 years, campaigns saw the internet as an unalloyed good. That I worked on Howard Dean's presidential campaign. We raised this stunning amount of money online, transformed the campaign. There were these blogs out there that were super useful. You saw sort of Facebook and Twitter being these incredible tools for good. How did you sort of see the way that campaigns and the parties change the way that they thought about the internet in this election?
Well, I don't know that I have too much historical data to go on, and so maybe we can compare notes and figure out, what the transition was. I think campaigns were pretty realistic about ways in which they needed to reach people, and these tools continue to be very good ways to reach the right people. But as you well know, there are so many ways that campaigns reach people. So there are, there's information that they can glean from various voter files, and we process that information. We help find ways to facilitate SMS messages to the right people who are going to be most receptive to that, or phone calls, or knocking on doors. Social media fits very nicely into that because it reaches yet another kind of cohort and reinforces messages that you may have heard through these other areas. But I think people were pretty realistic about how they were going to be used and how they were going to be misused. And I found that a lot of campaigns were very quick to identify things that were wrong and to escalate that either through us or to the social media companies. So I feel like a lot of them had some pretty good battle rhythm.
Kim, you, in your reporting this year, and then as you're talking about the election infrastructure system, I mean this is chronically underfunded, chronically understaffed, and decentralized by design. We're talking about, I think, whatever the number is, 100,000, 104,000 precincts across the country, largely run, at a very, very local level.
Yeah.
Have you seen signs of success or sort of places where you think there are sort of signs of hope of places that are taking this seriously and that can push forward towards sort of getting past the chronic underfunding into an era of more secure underlying election infrastructure?
So it was interesting, the California Attorney General earlier panel talked about California leading the way on legislation, privacy legislation in particular. California led the way on sort of election, I would say, integrity. Back in 2004, they were one of the first states. Many of the voting machines that we have came about in 2002 with the Help America Vote Act, and very quickly, California was using paperless machines made by Diebold. And they discovered that the company was installing uncertified software on machines in California. And so they immediately decertified all voting machines in California, and then they eventually passed a rule that all voting machines in California had to have a paper trail. And then we saw other states following suit. And so it really takes some kind of leadership of someone, am I echoing? Takes some kind of leadership of someone sort of setting the example. And a state like California did it. Florida then passed. They had a horrendous election in 2008, and they passed legislation that required paper trails. Ohio passed legislation that required paper trails. So I think that there's a lot of hope for someone to sort of take that step, and then it leads everyone else to follow suit. The missing data point here are now audits. So you've got the paper trail, but if you're not actually looking at the paper, it doesn't mean anything. And we do see an example. Colorado has led the way in that so far. They are the first to do what's called a risk limiting audit. They did a pilot last year, and there are other states that are now passing legislation that will require risk limiting audits. This is a statistically significant sampling of paper ballots where you look at them. And so we're starting to see that recognition that even if, everyone sort of points at the voting machines, and the voting machines aren't secure. And it's going to take years before we can get more secure voting machines. But even when you get more secure voting machines, they will never be unhackable. So what you have to do is then develop a system at the back end to detect when something has altered the software. And that the only thing that can do that for us is going to be paper ballots and risk limiting audits.
Bob, talk a little bit about sort of your perspective on voting infrastructure sitting where you are.
Yeah, so the DNC is, of course, separate from the state, and so the secretaries of states that run the voting systems are, a completely separate set of infrastructure. I would say that one of the interesting things is when I listen to the voting machine manufacturing representatives talk, I hear echoes of conversations I heard 10, 15 years ago in the tech community when we started to get people wanting to responsibly disclose, or in some cases irresponsibly disclose, vulnerabilities. And so we saw some of these companies years ago pushing back, trying to posture, trying to, in some cases, sue or make trouble for the people who are responsible for making these issues known. Today, we have this whole set of vocabulary. We have bug bounty programs. We have responsible disclosure. We have white hat hackers. We have a whole ecosystem of ways in which people can work together with third parties to report, or standards for having ways to report security-related issues. And that didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without some wailing and gnashing of teeth on occasion, but we kind of got there. And so now within the tech community, it should be a norm that you can find a way to report security vulnerabilities. The company will process that, and they'll either work to resolve it, or they will work to tell you why it's not a particular, it's not a vulnerability.
It has been pretty amazing how the election industry is where, I'm going to say it, where Microsoft was back in 2000. That resistance and that fighting against reporting. And it's remarkable to me that, that the election industry has really kept itself apart from the rest of industry.
Well, maybe a different way to look at it is it's like going through 7 stages of grief, and the tech community kind of went through it.
Yeah.
And so the question is, can we help this new industry, or this other industry, can we help them get through those stages of grief more quickly so it doesn't take 10, 15 years? Can we find a way to do it in the next year? And so, you know, I think that there are people who have been through that journey before who would be more than willing to help the various states who are the customers, as well as the voting machine manufacturers, find ways to do that. I'm sure if one of them tweeted out, hey, would anybody like to come work for free to walk through this program and help us build resiliency from that perspective, I guarantee you they'd be flooded with people saying, I will do this for free, I will take a leave of absence for my job for 6 months to help you. I guarantee you that would happen. They just have to take that leap of faith that there is, you know, there is hope on the other side, and there are ways to manage the issues, even though the financial rewards and the incentives are kind of different than they were for the tech companies. I guarantee you there'd be people willing to raise their hands and step up and help migrate, you know, usher them through that journey.
Kim, why do you think the election industry has been so slow to embrace these sort of relatively normal structures and systems in other fields?
So their customers are not consumers. Their customers are state election officials. And I hear this a lot in industrial control systems as well. So industrial control systems have had a really slow catch-up period as well in terms of getting security by design. And when I would ask the makers of industrial control systems or people who worked in security at chemical plants and electric grids and things like that, why aren't the products more secure? They said, well, customers never asked for it. And customers never asked for it because if they asked for it, if they asked for it, the vendor would say, okay, you want that security feature, it's going to cost you more. Yeah. And then the customer would say, well, my competitor isn't doing it. No one seems to be hacking us. I'm not going to do it. So there was no incentive. And with election officials, really actively fought security experts for a decade in many ways. And it's not that they weren't aware of the problems, they denied the problems. And without them demanding from the vendors to make more secure products, it just didn't happen.
Bob, how happy were you with the cooperation and information sharing with the Republican Party over the course of this election on security and information operations?
How happy was I with their cooperation? Well, I would say that we haven't spent a lot of time with the RNC. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we had our work cut out for us. I do know my counterparts over there, and I think now that we've gotten through this particular time period, I think we'll probably start to reach out to other organizations, not just the RNC, but there's a much larger ecosystem. For example, I have not gone and interviewed many secretaries of state. The voting machine system is still one that is on my list of places to go investigate and get through my education, because a lot of these areas are still they're still new to me. I may know the technology, but I don't know the application. Kim just alluded to some of the incentives problems. I don't know exactly how all of this works. So I think that will be one of the next things I need to do in order to make sure that I have my fingers in a lot of different parts of the ecosystem.
So I want to sort of pick up that and ask both Kim and Kevin as a closing question here. You know, again, we're as far from the 2020 election as we possibly can be. Still 2 years, not that far. What's the top of your list of what needs to be done between now and 2020? And Kevin, maybe I'll start with you.
I'm deferring. Ladies first.
So in terms of elections, DHS has made some inroads in terms of communication and information sharing with state and county election officials. They've made some inroads in setting up sensors and things like that. All of this is just the outward-facing, the internet-facing systems. There's the whole back-end infrastructure that hasn't gotten attention. And so what really needs to happen is boots-on-the-ground assessments of configurations of systems, practices and processes, making sure that people don't have rogue Wi-Fis in their elections offices, that people aren't plugging their phones into an air-gapped system to charge it, things like that. So all of that is still missing from the process, so that boots on the ground needs to happen in the next 2 years.
Kevin?
So the question was, what to do for the 2020 elections?
Yeah, and
I look at it and, what was it, the year 2000 or was it 2002? We had hanging chads. We're going to do better than that. And I also believe that we're going to have shields up. I'm not losing sleep over it when it comes to the vote tally. And I don't lose sleep over the information operations, but I actually think that's more sinister. It's a real issue to figure out how people are influencing the voters' mindset and who these people are. It's one thing to get lied to with fake news. It's a whole other thing to be lied to by fake identities. And I think we'll do a much better job in regards to looking for that. And I do believe as a country, I have a very optimistic view of the future and how we're going to do electronic voting as a nation. And I can tell you in this midterm election, this was a midterm election, no offense, but it wasn't a presidential election. Congratulations to all the winners. But we're going to see a lot more in 2020. But what I did see in this election was shields up. We were in over a dozen op centers. There was law enforcement to our right during the election. There's election officials to our left. If you're going to want to harm the election vote tally, I believe you're going to be doing it in person. Maybe that's to your point.
The insider threat, yeah.
And that's something that I think we have a lot of safeguards against. So I'm pretty optimistic on the 2020 election, at least in regards not to the outcome of it, but to the tally vote. And I'll leave you with, I still think it's also the last choice of an adversary to pick changing the tallies. Right now, for most of the places where we did operations for this election, every packet coming in and every packet going out was captured. If anything did happen, we've got a record of it, and people were responding live. And it was people that worked at competitive organizations. We're going to go shields up. If anything bad does happen, I don't see how it's not noticed, and we'll interrogate the situation at that moment. And then I think over time, we're going to develop systems that we'll have confidence in. I don't think you'll ever get 100% confidence. We'll always have folks that'll try to make doubt in the outcomes. But I feel pretty damn good. I feel a lot better about 2020 than 2016. We'll get it right.
I learned something new there.
We're going to get it right?
Yeah, that's good.
He's worried about it, I guess. I'm not.
Maybe
we'll get the winner right. I mean, we'll have to have a margin of error of a pretty high percentage to get wrong, right? So.
Well, thank you so much. John, come on up.